Chapter 5, Seller Counseling. You know, when you start to work with sellers, perhaps even at the listing presentation, certainly even perhaps before the listing presentation, but certainly before the seller signs a listing agreement, we as agents have to discuss a number of issues with the sellers, and these include agency issues and marketing issues, how offer and acceptance are going to be handled, disclosure issues, how showings will be held, potential open houses, how that's going to be handled, and certainly last but not least the CMAs, or what we call comparative market analysis price. Certainly as you're going through all of these issues with the seller, in the back of their mind they want to hear how much. So that's an important aspect. We'll talk a little bit about CMAs and how we come up with prices for properties. We usually say CMA when we talk about residential property, comparative market analysis. Sometimes with commercial property we call these BPOs, or broker price opinions. In either event, it's the agent coming up with a quote guesstimate of what they feel the fair market value is of the property, and give that to the sellers, because we have to obviously establish a listing price on sales. We have to establish on the sales process, we have to establish what we're going to be listing the property at. So those are a few of the issues that need to be discussed. Page 81 and 82 talk a little bit about what we talked about before, CMAs, where the broker comes up and helps the seller determine the listing price of the property. And notice it's what I said was that the agent helps the seller to determine the price of the property. It is the seller that in fact determines what the eventual listing price of the property is going to be. It's the seller's decision, not the broker's decision. But he uses our expert advice, counsel, and the process that we go through, and as we came up with what we thought the fair market value of the property would be. And typically we use a process called CMA, or comparative market analysis, whereby we tell sellers that your property is going to be pretty much worth what comparable properties that sold recently sold for. The market value of the property is what we're trying to determine, and then from the market value we'll determine a listing price, which may be above or below market value depending on a lot of other circumstances that the seller is under. But the market value is the most probable price a property would bring in an arm's length transaction, sort of a fair transaction under normal circuit conditions on the open market. That would be market value. As I said, what we list the property from may or may not be the same as market value. We should know that if the seller wants to set his property so unreasonably high that the agent does not feel he would have a fair or adequate chance to market the property, he might want to reject the listing. And he wants to reject it not because this is a bad thing for him, the agent, but it probably would be a disservice to the seller to take an overpriced listing that is too high. And I know this is always kind of a roll of the dice as you're dealing with sellers, but I do think as an obligation as an agent you need to determine whether or not that the listing price that the seller is thinking about putting the property, wants to put the property in the market for, it may be better for you to reject the listing. In fact, it may be better to reject the listing, let it get put on the market, let the listing terminate or cancel, and then come back and then list it at a reasonable price. But I think part of your obligation as a fiduciary to the seller is to help them determine the sale price of the property, and if in your opinion this is too high, you'd be doing a disservice, you probably should reject the listing. One of the things that we see here that I think is helpful is on page 81. They give you a bit of a seller agency checklist, and it's probably not a bad little checklist to take a look at. They talk about the initial contract with this contact with the seller, some of the items you should be discussing. They talk about after the employment agreement is signed, and then they talk a little bit about making appointments and how that process is going to be handled. Certainly these are all the critical key things you should discuss with the seller prior to take a listing, so that everything goes smooth and you don't have difficulties after. Current or most recent property taxes is important because when you're taking the property tax information down, the new buyer that property tax that the seller is paying may or may not be the same amount that a new buyer would be paying, because perhaps the seller has got some exemptions we don't know about. For instance, a senior citizen or homestead exemption that may or may not apply to new buyers. So make sure when you're inquiring about taxes that you find out whether or not the seller has got other exemptions that they're eligible for that maybe a buyer would not be eligible for, or most buyers would not be eligible for. Proof of title at the bottom. I don't think proof of title is something you need to be too concerned about, but you might want to ask the seller for the last maybe title policy that they had. You don't have to look for their deed, they may not have it. But proof of title either by a deed or maybe by an old title insurance policy, the last title insurance policy would show them in title. Probably important to look at, because one of the things you do want to find out is who is in title. Is it both parties or only one of the parties? Because you'll want to have, either one or both sign that document. Zoning classification of the property, not too critical if we're talking about residential property, but I think if you're involved in any kind of commercial property, you want to make sure that you know what the zoning classification is, so that potential purchasers will know whether or not they can make the use that they want to make from that property as it relates to zoning classification. So something that probably more is pertaining to commercial property than residential. In Illinois, of course, we have a number of disclosures we have to tell the seller that they have to make or that we have to make. And the disclosures found on page 87 are material facts that really relates to habitability. Anything that affects the habitability of the property, the seller must disclose and we must disclose. Disclosure of special interest, that would be an agent's disclosure. If the agent were either selling their own property or buying property from their own behalf, they must disclose their status as an Illinois licensee on these contracts. Disclosure of special compensation. If we as an agent are getting any kickback from anybody, we must disclose that kickback or quote referral fee that we're getting because we're going to refer them to an attorney or to an appraiser, and the attorney appraiser is going to kick us back some money. Again, that kickback has to go through our sponsoring broker, and it must be disclosed to all parties, and it must also show up on our RESPA statement, on the closing statement. Earnest money in purchaser default, who gets it. As far as the seller is concerned, if there is some provision where when the purchaser defaults, the seller would not get the earnest money, then we need to notify the seller of that. So the seller needs to know from the beginning, even before a sales contract is signed, what might or might not happen on the event of purchase defaults as it relates to the earnest money. And then, of course, then the other place we're going to look is what's on the sales contract, what it says. So let's keep a heads up for our sellers as far as the disposition of earnest money, either on a deal that goes through or a deal that doesn't go through. Disclosure of property condition. The property condition report, of course, is that residential property disclosure report that we've talked about, and we're going to see it in other chapters, and I think we covered it in the earlier chapter, chapter 3. You can go back and take a look at that disclosure report and the obligations of the seller and the agents in completing that report. Realtor Code of Ethics requirements on page 81 at the bottom. They talk a little bit about if you're a member of the Realtor organization, the NAR, local boards, the state association. Our Code of Ethics also has other ethical requirements that we need to adhere to as part of our Code of Ethics that we've agreed to abide by when we became Realtors. And you might want to look over some of the ethical requirements in addition to, of course, the state of Illinois legal requirements in taking listings and working with sellers or landlords. Advertising, we must get written permission from the seller to do any advertising on the property, whether it's in print or via the internet, any other media, we must get written permission. And we must know that any advertising that we do cannot be fraudulent or deceptive or inherently misleading. We also must know that blind ads are specifically prohibited. That a blind ad is any ad that we put either on the internet or in any print or any other media where we do not have the name of the licensee, that is placing that ad, nor the company name of the licensee, and that also includes the licensee's franchise if it's a franchise, so the company name and franchise affiliation. And then we also need to put the area of the advertised property. You don't necessarily have to put the city, but you really need to put sort of the area that it's in. Typically it's the city, but if it's a rural area, maybe you can't put a city. But we do need to identify the approximate area that advertised property is located in. If we don't, that's a blind ad that's prohibited, and you can be fined for that, and you can have your license disciplined. Advertising on the internet, no deceptive URLs. That would be that www address up there. Don't have a deceptive one. If your company is a brokerage company, don't put www.cheapforeclosures.com if you're not in fact specializing in foreclosed properties, or www.auctionsandotherservices.com. Okay, whatever your business you're engaged in, be careful not to have a URL that might be inherently deceptive. I've seen some ads where the URL is for a brokerage company, but when you click on it, it's for somebody offering services to do counseling for individuals who are behind on their mortgage payments and on distressed property counseling. Okay, not the same. So be careful of this URLs. Framing, where you copy another firm's listing into your site. Again, you need permission to do that and disclose on your site. Don't have deceptive meta tags, keywords, links. This is more for the tech people that understand how you put these meta tags or keywords onto your the background of your website, and this helps drive people and increase your position on the search engines. So no deceptive meta tags. You might not want to use another firm's name, for instance, as a meta tag if it's a copyrighted name. Get seller's permission, and again, remove references after all listings end. If you advertise on the internet, just a couple of extra things. We have to disclose the firm's name and the state of the licensed company, what state or states it's licensed in. Because the advertising on the internet goes throughout the whole world, if you will. So when we're looking at that listing, we also want to know the name of the firm and where that firm is licensed at. Don't advertise another firm's listings without their permission. Sometimes other firms will let you take their listing and put it up on their website. So now you have other properties. If you can, draw people to your website, that's okay. But if you have another firm's listings, you need their permission. And also, you need to put on the website that this is another firm's listing and list the name of the firm who actually has the property listed. Don't hold it out to be your listing. Make sure that in large letters, it clearly shows this is another brokerage firm's listings that you have permission to advertise. If you advertise on any social networking, whether it's the Twitter or Facebook or something like that, you must have special permission for social networking advertising. So all of this stuff you have to have permission as relative to, in relationship to advertising on the internet. And don't forget that when the listing is over, the deal is done, or the listing is terminated for whatever reasons, remove all references on all your areas that you possibly can, whether it's the social networks or whether it's on your website. When the listing is over, has terminated, or the sale is completed, remove all references to that listing as soon as you can. Okay, Chapter 5, did a nice little tour of that. Take your review quiz, grade it. If you have questions, certainly give us a call or email us on any concerns you have, and we'll see you in Chapter 6.